word until I know it's all, you know, working. I don't want to save the password. All right.
Looks like people are starting to check in.
Yeah. Just going to share it and no, there we go. All right. And the setting it so I have this little contraption so I should be able to see comments whether or not they're posted online or like across all the platforms.
Oh, okay,
But
I see that here on the chat. We got someone from Wales, which is cool.
oh yeah. All right. Excellent. Hi Peter. Oh, hi Michael. All right. So as we're getting uh started and such, for those of you that are already on, feel free to tag somebody or share it and such. And if you have questions that you want um, us to discuss, feel free to share them in the comment section on any of the places this is streaming. Um, but those of you that send them in advance, you don't have to reshare questions. Uh, all right. How do you feel about me? You want me to hit record now? Are you ready to rock, Diana?
I am I am as ready as I will ever be.
Oh, all righty. Excellent. Normally when we've done these, it took me a lot longer to get everything set up to actually start. I don't want to set expectations though for such quick uh
Well,
setup.
it's after the school year, so you're more organized. You know.
It's true. Didn't grade any papers today.
Hallelujah. That's the best thing about not being at academia. No papers and no committee meetings. And other than that, I miss teaching, but boy, that stuff takes up so much time.
Yep. There's nothing quite like a meeting about a new mandatory form. Those are that's a special kind.
Oh, for a couple years, I had a part time. So I was working on a grant project.
Mhm.
Virginia Theological Seminary, and they rarely. I didn't really have to go to meetings, but there was this one meeting they wanted me to come to and talk about the grant and the project, and the faculty spent 90 minutes talking about the placement of the baptismal font in the seminary chapel. And before that, I had
Mm.
never worked in a divinity school setting or been to a faculty meeting in a divinity school setting. And I got to tell you, that was the worst 90 minutes I've ever spent in a faculty meeting. People can get really upset about moving a baptismal font 6 inches. So
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
it's astonishing. So
Excellent. All right, so I'm gonna hit record.
okay.
So oh well, thank you, Zoom, for telling us the recording's in progress.
There you go.
Well,
I have to press I approve.
oh, I'm glad you approved. Well, friends, guess what? Diana Butler Bass is back on the podcast and hanging out in a live stream. And we're going to be talking about Jesus. And there's a whole host of other questions people send in that are related to different topics and things that Diana's written about. But one of the most fun questions that was sent in, and it's not related to Jesus, even though your new book is indeed about Jesus, is what was what was the new discovery for Diana in lockdown? Either like TV show, music, movie, craft, activity. What was the thing that if there was no lockdown, you would have not found it? And then you said, oh, I'm down.
Oh. Oh my gosh, that is a fun and great question. I have to confess that murder shows on Netflix, I became
Mm.
one of those people. And so when Saturday Night Live did the send up of the women who wanted to kick their husbands out of their houses during lockdown to watch murder shows, that literally is my house. So I will sometimes go into the bedroom and close the door, and my husband Richard will peek in, and he'll go, "What are you watching?" And I'll go, "Murder show," and he just leaves. So I've now watched murder shows in Norwegian, Spanish, English, French, you name it, from all over the world, and so I've been kind of hooked.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I followed the viewing path of my 12 turned 13-year-old over lockdown. So we did like all the big trilogies, like, Star Wars, Harry Potter, watched everything and through Lord of the Rings. We even watched all the Hobbit movies, which compared to the Lord of the Rings, but they had plenty of fights, so he liked it. Then it got into like 90s movies with like the people I watched in SNL. And, every one of those movies has like 2 jokes that he looks at me. He's like, "Are you allowed to do that?" I'm like, yes. And
I saw some of my friends who are in their 30s just this week. There's been here in the States running on a couple of networks, actually, the old Back to the Future series.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been showing it over and over again. And so it's really interesting seeing people I know who are on Twitter who are, 20, 30 years younger than me. They'd never seen it before. To see their reactions to Back to the Future has been kind of hilarious and kind of precious as well. So.
Yeah. So if you haven't talked your kids into watching the Back to the Future movies, you really need to step up.
That's right.
Step up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You gotta free the DeLorean and Jesus. Look at that transition.
What kind of millennial are you if you haven't introduced your kids to Back to the Future yet? Because you got to make fun of the skateboard and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. Well, so you have your books right behind you. Grab it for a second so you can show everyone.
I have another one on my desk.
Oh, you even have it conveniently placed next to the plant, right under the plant.
Yeah, that's back there so people can't forget, and my agent says that has to be there at all times. So.
Oh. So. Well, Diana, I have not had an agent rate my background of Zoom during lockdown. It's really, I'm going for a particular aesthetic.
Yeah, you are, I think. Sort of early medieval basement.
Yeah, or like someone that was like went alt-right and started building bombs in their basement. There was always that as an option.
Or you could be a good guy and you could be going for British lockdown during World War II.
Oh, yeah, I get better. But
so anyway, this is the book, Freeing Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has a long subtitle, Rediscovering Jesus as Friend, Teacher, Savior, Lord, Way, and Presence. Just like in the 19th century. I've always wanted a long subtitle like that.
Oh, well, I just want you to know that I was just glad the book wasn't technically a Christology, because I was like, I liked it too much. I didn't want to say it was my favorite Christology that came out the same year mine did.
I know.
So I appreciate just sticking with Jesus. But maybe you could say a bit about when you go to write a book on Jesus, like where did the idea come from, and then when did you decide to take your particular take of all the different Jesuses you've met, your own biography being a way you kind of come back to Jesus in a sense?
Oh gosh, well, I did not start out to write a book about Jesus. As a matter of fact, that's been a kind of thing that I always thought I would leave to my friends. Who are like New Testament scholars, people with actual credentials to write a book about Jesus. And with being a person who was trained in religious studies, I'm actually kind of sensitive to those things. Mm-hmm. So I don't take on topics that I don't feel like I have some level of ability to write on thoughtfully. So Jesus was always on kind of a side topic for me. But what happened was, I had been for a couple years, mostly out of attending the Wild Goose Festival here in in North Carolina, not far from where I live, about an 8-hour drive. There's so many people who no longer are comfortable with church, and they come from a lot of different traditions. They're mainliners who just are kind of through with it. There are lots of people who used to be evangelicals who don't want to go to church anymore, or who are looking for some new church. And for the longest times, as I listened to folks, and they were really working on, excuse me, they were working on issues of sort of putting back together theological pieces after they had been through some initial stages of what everybody calls deconstruction. I thought, well, I'd like to write a handbook for them, and just sort of a guide to theology beyond church. And so I suggested that to my publisher. They loved the idea. And I had laid out that entire book. That entire book is literally in outline form here in my office. And I started writing in the summer of 2019. And I just didn't know which chapter I should start with. Should I begin with talking about the Bible? Should I talk about the end times? Should I talk about death? I mean, I was really going to handle a lot of big sort of theological topics, and try to do it in a way that was, I think, signature work for me, kind of warm and inviting and creative, and giving people freedom to come to some new conclusions about these things. So I thought, the easiest chapter to write in this book is going to be about Jesus. And so I thought, that's where I'll start. And I started, and I wrote within a short period of time, somewhere up to about 70 or 80 pages. And it was when I got to that many pages, I thought, if I'm writing a single chapter about Jesus and it's going to be 100 pages long, I think I'm writing the church dogmatics, not a shorthand book to Christianity post-religion. And so I called my publisher and I said, this is what's going on. And they said, well, maybe you just need to talk to your editor, which I thought was kind of hilarious. Okay, you're going to cut out 60 pages of what I've just written. And we did have a conversation, and it came clear to me that I was really interested in writing a book about Jesus. And the more I talked to my editor back that summer, the more I thought, I felt nervous still about the academic credential of it. And I thought, well, I actually do have something to say about Jesus, and it doesn't come from the fact that I have a PhD in New Testament studies, but it comes from my own life. Yeah. And that really, I think for any Christian, there is a certain kind of gravitas. There's a certain kind of confident expertise we should be able to bring, any Christian should be able to bring to talking about Jesus, to sharing our stories about Jesus. And I thought it would be a gift to model talking about Jesus from personal experience. And then, of course, because I preach all the time and I do study church history and I know lots about theology, is that I could weave that stuff into my experience as a way of introducing people to some new theological ideas. So that's where it came from. It was going to be an entirely different project. It started birthing itself, which makes me absolutely crazy when that happens when I'm writing a book, because it's happened more than once. And we just went from there. And I was nervous the whole time I was writing that book.
Well, one of the things that when you said you wanted to bring your tone and also your own experience to it, and it kind of function as a model for people figuring out, Christianity after whatever we just
Christianity after religion. Hey, yeah. Great title for a book.
Oh, actually, we should write that down. One of the things, even in working with people in the systematic theology class, and then they're like, yeah, but I don't know if I know everything, or I don't know enough to really talk and all that kind of thing. One of the things I love about your book is, every Christian is the authority for their own encounter with God. And you want to know what's thoroughly fascinating when you talk to anybody? You know American church history and as a professional, but you also know Diana's experience of faith. And I think the way in which the authority you have to share and tell your own story vulnerably, and the way your encounter with Jesus has evolved and changed and morphed over time, when you're setting that alongside also the gifts and skills you have as a historian and as an excellent communicator, which not all academics know how to do, I think it's a permission slip to both any Christian or someone who may not use that word but wants to figure out how to free Jesus, right? Along with scholars who are so often hesitant to tell the very biography that animates their work, right? So just I've done, I don't know, like 20 interviews, about a Christology. I'm pretty sure most of the people interviewed me wouldn't understand, and they were like, "But I'm gonna have him on. He has a podcast." And almost all the time, I end up telling the stories, which why I wrote the book that does not tell those stories in it, and people find that interesting. I'm like, yeah, but this was for an academic press, so I didn't put that in there. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like it's permission in both the context, because you're such a hybrid scholar and communicator, both for the generation of people figuring out like faith after religion, and for academics trying to figure out what do we do with what we've been given, and how do we contribute it.
Yeah, I think that. Excuse me, I got a little bit of an allergy going today, I think. I think you're exactly right, is that I've known so many interesting people in academia over the years. And a lot of people, especially people in Jesus scholarship, have very interesting stories. I think of friends and colleagues, who grew up fundamentalists and then rejected it. And yet they still were trying to figure things out. And they wound up going to seminary and graduate school and wrestling with the text over a lifetime. And their own experience came into that mix and helped to shape them as the scholars they are. And that would include everybody from Bart Ehrman, who doesn't go to church, and if he does it kind of more culturally for like holidays and stuff. But he grew up fundamentalist, and he just came to reject it all and all the supernatural elements of Christianity. He sort of wrote his way out of Christianity, but he still writes about Jesus, and he does it in provocative and really interesting and powerful ways that I actually love to read Bart's books. I feel like I'm kind of reading the spiritual journey of a truly post-Christian soul. And then you have somebody like, Dom Crossan, who was a monk in Ireland and has a huge long story about his relationship with the bishop and the Catholic Church and coming to America and getting married and everything else, or Amy Jill Levine, who's Jewish, but nevertheless winds up writing about Jesus, or the late Marcus Borg, who was a really good friend of mine. And what I always found myself to be in my friendship with Marcus was almost like a sort of a younger sister to him in certain kinds of ways, where he knew the scholarship and he loved it. But there was this other thing for him, and it was always about experientialism and mysticism. And I know few scholars who could talk about their spiritual experiences of God with quite as much depth as Marcus could. He didn't do it all the time, but when you got him to that conversation, it was extraordinary. So I've been lucky enough to know really interesting people, and a lot of people who aren't that well known, just colleagues, people I've worked with through the years. And I think the world would be richer if people knew the stories that were behind the way they approach their subjects in the classroom, or the sermons they preach, or the articles they've written, because often that's in some ways it's fuel, for their ideas. And we can never separate a person's ideas about a subject from their experience of the subject in their own lives.
Yeah. So when you talk about the story behind it, you recently in your newsletter from the Cottage, which everyone should sign up for if they're not, that you talk about there actually being a story and a narrative running through your last series of books that start with religion after Christianity, and then you see it in Grounded and Gratitude and Freeing Jesus. when you're thinking of like all the different things that are erupting right in religion, be it like COVID, starting to wrestle more deeply with racism, to like even the stuff with the Southern Baptist Convention this week, and there's so many elements of things going on that we're processing. What maybe tell us that big story you were hoping to do, and because you've been attending to those types of questions and themes, when you look back, what were the things you're like, wow, well, I didn't anticipate this being the case, or shocked by, and what were the things like, I told you so? Diana wants to say, I told you so.
I have done that, a little bit of that recently. And I feel bad. No, I don't. Nobody ever feels bad for saying I told you so. Even
but
though
you can pretend you feel bad.
That's right. You have to. It's sort of the
Diana
way it's
feels bad. It's not. Right. She doesn't want to completely gloat, but she has a right to. So.
I feel like I do in certain cases. One of them was actually this week with the Southern Baptist Convention. I had literally been talking for 15 years in speeches on the road, and occasionally mentioned in books and articles that liberal churches weren't the only ones who were declining, but that conservative churches were declining as well. And I'd always use the example of the Southern Baptist Convention, because I knew this guy who worked inside the statistics office of the Southern Baptist Convention. And even when the Southern Baptist Convention was claiming that they had 18 million members, my friend who was over in that office told me that if half of those people, he said, were on an FBI terrorist watch list, the government couldn't find them. And so the idea that the Southern Baptist Convention was so huge and that they weren't just experiencing decline, he literally let me in on a secret that he said it was a total lie, that they were struggling too. And so those statistics have come out a lot more in recent years, especially this last week. They finally are talking about the fact that they had the biggest decline in the last really 3 years that they've had since 1960. And it's kind of stunning. So anyway, that was my big, I tweeted that. How long have I been saying this in lectures? I wanted the world to know. But
well, I responded to it, and then somehow got I got a friend that I went to undergrad with at a small Baptist school for undergrad, who's now a Southern Baptist minister.
Oh my.
And he explained to me how they lost all these numbers. Do you want to guess what the real cause of the Southern Baptist decline was?
They haven't been faithful enough to true doctrine.
Yeah, but you know what they got sidetracked on?
Critical race theory.
Yes. You know what ruined the Southern Baptist Convention?
Critical race theory.
He asked hypothetically, and I said, Trump idolatry? And he goes, no, we have a bunch of CRT sympathizers.
Yeah.
And I was like, I know 0 African Americans who think that the SBC has millions of CRT sympathizers that are ruining the church. And I've been unfriended. So
I'm so sorry.
I know
encourage that to happen.
I was like, I don't know what to tell you, but okay. But the big picture.
Yeah. The big picture is, I can turn around and get the other book.
Yeah.
So the thing that I wrote in the cottage was about this book that we were joking about the title about a little while ago. It's a very pretty cover. It always has been a pretty cover. Christianity After Religion. It kind of is shiny. It's nice. And Christianity After Religion was written in 2010, early 2011. It came out in early 2012. And this particular book had 2 purposes. And one was to alert my friends. By that time, I was on the road a lot. I was working with lots of denominations. I'd already written 5 other books about congregational vitality and sort of the future of church. And so I was becoming pretty well known with those sets of questions. And I wanted to alert my friends to the fact of the trend lines. And what was becoming obvious to me, as well as other people who pay attention to trend lines in sociology of religion, other fields in religious studies, was that the membership statistics in the United States were beginning to resemble kinds of the trend lines that we had seen about religious disaffiliation in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. And people have talked about Europe for years and years and years as being post-Christian or a secular society with sort of a remnant of Christian memory, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone would always say that the United States is the exception. That was part of American exceptionalism, because we were so highly religious, and that we were always going to be far more Christian than any other country in our economic and developmental sort of space. And it was beginning to look like, right after the turn of the millennium, that was not true, that the United States was becoming far more pluralistic, and even having these sorts of potentially large communities of people who were atheists, agnostics, humanists, secular people, and certainly people who were then calling themselves spiritual but not religious. And so I wanted to alert folks who I worked with, my most faithful readers, to these trends, and let them know what was coming. And that way they could, I thought, do better planning, sort of adjust their denominational missions, rethink their visions.
Which we have to admit, mainline Protestants have done such a great job at that.
Yeah, they've been terrible at it. And it makes me so sad. Although I think individuals have really tried. There are some people who really worked hard on these issues, but the institutions are so lumbering. It's not like turning around the Titanic, really. It's like trying to get a dinosaur to train for the Olympics. I mean, it's almost, you can get the Titanic to turn around, but dinosaurs don't win Olympic medals. You're just not going to get a gigantic sort of creature lumbering through a forest that can become a world-class Olympic sprinter. And so anyhow, these denominations, I loved them. I still love them, and I wanted them to do better. So that was a big part of Christianity after religion. But I knew it was not enough to simply warn them about numbers, because it's easy to avoid those kinds of things. And so I decided that I would also suggest that there was an emerging shape of Christian community that could adapt to, or perhaps even stem, the numerical decline and help them to be more faithful to their identity. And the emerging shape of what I thought was the future of Christianity is in the center 4 chapters of Christianity after religion. And I talk about in those chapters what it means to belong, what it means to behave, and what it means to believe. And so and there's nothing new in that. You and I know, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening in also know, that that's just sort of the classic 3 ways, the 3 sort of windows into understanding what a religion is like. You look at those 3 things: how they understand identity, belonging, what their practices are like, how they behave, and then finally the things that they hold to be true about humankind, God, etc. And so what they believe. And so we know that, and that's simple stuff. That's Religious Studies 101. But the more provocative part of that section was, I suggested that the actual conceptualization of identity, behavior, practice, and believing was undergoing a transformation. And that transformation was around experience that we were shifting away from. And this was sort of basic. I know you've been doing this thing on Charles Taylor. Sort of basic, really, Charles Taylor, is that we were moving away from externally driven, inherited senses of identity, practice, and of personal conviction, toward self-wrought, experiential questions of all of those things. And so the upshot was, I argued that the question around belonging had changed from a question of membership towards relationship. Instead of what institution do I belong to? What do my membership cards look like? Who am I in relationship with? And how do those relationships shape my sense of who I am in the world? And then the second question, behavior, changed around a shift from externally given rules and procedures, like how do you do this thing, toward what are we going to do? And so the shift is from rules to practices, from learning to become an expert in something like, say, Robert's Rules of Order, or the polity of a given denomination, or some sort of guide towards lifestyle behavior. Baptists, I don't drink, dance, and chew, and I don't go with girls who do. And so those are the rules, and people had to become experts at those in order to become good at those traditions. But now the question was, oh, what are we going to do? You know, nobody knew what to do anymore. The rule books didn't seem to work. And so that is a move towards becoming skilled at creating new habits in people, forming character out of repetitive actions that relate to a larger story. Like, you know, maybe we should practice hospitality. Perhaps we should devote our lives to justice. That's very different than a rules orientation. And then the third thing, believing, was changing up from acceptance of a set of ideas around dogma or creed, toward an experiential knowing. Is that the ground? And you said it very clearly at the very beginning of our conversation. The ground shifted toward people being able to tell their stories and to be able to narrate the truthfulness that we know in the world. And that shift, not what do I believe, as in I believe in God the Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, but rather how we believe. And that's really what Freeing Jesus is all about. The core question is, how can a 60-year-old woman 2 decades into the 21st century still believe? How does she believe in Jesus? And, you know, after all of this, after the end of Christendom and feminism and post-Holocaust theology and everything else, you know, it's like, how does she believe in Jesus? And so that's the story I tell. And in the Substack, the last thing I'll just sort of say towards your question is that after I wrote the Blue Book, Christianity After Religion, I knew that I needed to dedicate more work to each one of those chapters, the single chapters in the book, which are really kind of good. I went back and I reread them a few weeks ago and they surprised me. I had forgotten there were things in there that I had actually written. And so I went, oh, I like that. It's a great idea. And so so then I decided that my next 3 books should probably be about belonging, behaving, and believing. And so Grounded followed Christianity After Religion. And that was a book about where God is. And the essential thesis of Grounded is we find God when we are in relationship with neighbor and nature. And by being in that relationship with the world around us, with creation and with other people in human community, that's how we know God. That's how we find our relationship with God. And then the second book in this series was, well, what behavior needs to be held out as a significant, humane, and transformative healing practice for the world. And that's when I make the case that gratitude is I think, one of the primary avenues of optimism and hopefulness to be able to make a difference in the world. I think that it is really the most transformative, the most radical of all human practices. And so that was great, the book Grateful. And then what I knew is that the third book in this series, Following Christianity After Religion, had to be about belief. And so that's why I was going to write a handbook towards Christian theology, because I wanted to write about how do you believe things. And so that's where I started with that question. And how do I believe things became, how do I believe this one specific thing? Because I think that our understanding of who Jesus is one of the things that we hold on to the longest, even after people leave church. And I think it's also the thing that more liberal church people trip over the most, because there are so many wrong-headed and even hurtful notions about who Jesus is. And so I wanted to clear that up. So that's been the task. I've been involved in this project of writing these 4 books now for 12, 13 years. And I think that what has happened for me is that the pathway through this project, and I didn't start it on day one, it kept growing as I was moving through it. I think it's the most important work that I could have ever imagined doing. And I think it has kept me focused and intellectually creative and innovative, and has helped me understand the world just so much better. And I'm actually very proud of these 4 books, and I think they say something that is incredibly important for the way that we are living now, but also what potential the future holds for still being Christian.
Mm-hmm. No, my experience reading you and then getting to know you is that your intuitions are very good. And if I like, oh, I think she might be overstating this in Christianity After Religion. I mean, I love being religious. Like there are multiple places where like
Right.
I've just learned to trust your intuition, and I think there's a whole lot of people that do. And one of the things that strikes me, looking back at Christianity After Religion and then how that has shaped things going forward, is that so much of our continued anxiety for people within the church is, I think, that failure to come to grips with just the shifting religious spiritual landscape that, like, just think of what questions we ask in surveys and what numbers we keep track of, right? Like the assumption is you're either religious if you participate in some congregation on some frequency, or you're non-religious if you don't. And I think one of the beautiful things about after that book, Doing Grounded, is there are people who haven't been in a church in a long time and maybe never go, that could read it and go, yeah, this is articulating like what a new account of the contemporary spiritual ethos. And there are people that have never left the church and they're like, yeah, that's the most beautiful account of what happens in a liturgy I've ever heard, Diana. Right? Like, and underneath that is this shift from that the biggest religious question post Christendom isn't like do you go or not, and then do you go to the right tribe, and now we're going to battle that out. It's like, is there some narrative and reservoir of meaning that opens you up to something more than kind of the flattened existence of modernity gone awry, right? Like, and there's all sorts of different ways. Like even the wild goose example, you go there and there's like a bunch of Episcopalians that keep the hours together in a tent next to like Wiccan Christians and then the Pentecostals that read your spirit. And you can usually tell what part of the church you're in as to which of those 3 creeps you out the most. Right. But I would love to hear like how you, like, what is the question you think that drive, like that we should be asking? Like if you wanted to get better data and you wanted to understand, our current religious and spiritual climate, are there particular questions surveyors could ask that are better rather than like, where do you go and how often you go? For example, I did a survey of people on my email list. So like I emailed 50,000 people, got, most of them, I guess, listen to the podcast in some frequency enough that I get to hijack their inbox. And like a third of them go to church every week, unless like there's a real reason. And a third of them never go.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like all the things in between. And then like a year or so later, when I emailed people, I gave a different survey and was trying to figure out like, what kind of questions do you ask? Because these are people that listen to a 90-minute conversation, like
Right,
with super nerds, and not one's normally gifted like you to talk to normal people. Like I have to edit it. I would never live stream it. You know what I mean? So like, I feel like there's something going on. Like what kind of questions or you think would be better to really get a grasp of how things are changing?
well, this is actually why I'm not a sociologist of religion, is because I could never figure out what to say in a survey. And for 10 years I served on the founding board of Public Religion Research Incorporated, which has become probably, I think, the most sophisticated research firm in North America on religious questions. And so I'm very good friends with its president, Robbie Jones. Robert P. Jones is his formal name. And he's written a couple really good books in the last 4 years on racism and Christianity. And so what I tend to do with this kind of question when people ask me is I defer to Robbie, and they've been trying to figure this out. And Robbie has a PhD in survey construction and all this kind of stuff. And they've been struggling, as have other people, with trying to get at what it means to be a person of faith in the 21st century. Because you can kind of measure religiosity with those old-fashioned questions about church attendance, etc. At least you can measure old-fashioned religiosity with those old-fashioned questions. And you can also sort of measure spirituality. People have gotten a little better at that by asking people if they've ever had a mystical experience, or you can ask people things about what they practice outside of church. Is there a spiritual dimension to their commitment to, say, Black Lives Matter? I mean, you can kind of think about ways of doing that. But that still lacks that depth of what you're getting at. And, maybe this is part of the reason why I get frustrated even with my own work, is that eventually my passion is to do exactly what you just explained, is to be able to speak in a meaningful way about Christian theological ideas and the great narratives of the Bible and the life of Jesus, all this Christian stuff, to be able to speak well about that to people who are both post-church and people who are in church, to the people who continue liking that 1/3 who couldn't live without that on a weekly basis, which is, I don't see that as immature or anything. That I have no judgment about how people pick on this spectrum. I see both of these choices as perfectly legitimate expressions of contemporary Christianity, whether you do it in your garden or with a group of friends on a protest march, or whether you are doing it in a liturgy that has been set, or whether you do it in both. I'm not taking sides, because I think that all of those things can express this same impulse towards these questions about these shifts around relational belonging, around getting to practices that create a more just and healed world, and toward the primacy of, not the primacy, how about the authority that each one of us bears in witnessing to the truthfulness of the universe. And so, so I don't know how to measure that. I really don't.
Well,
And
something that just popped in my mind when you said like measuring it. I think part of that is, I mean, one, the multiplicity, right? Like of, I don't know, symbolic languages and rituals and habits that are connected to someone engaging a depth dimension, right, or of some sort, is pluralism. But like there's a pluralism to it. But Alistair McIntyre talked about how one of the outcomes of the West cultivating a kind of the potential for a robust life apart from an inherited superstructure is that there's the privatization of the good life, that modernity, because it recognizes diversity and beautiful lives lived in different religious traditions at first, right? Now, oh, the Catholics count in America. Now, Judeo-Christian, or, you start expanding it, and then you realize your atheist neighbor's a better human than you, and then it, like, all bets are off, right? And so recognizing that pluralism for a real good reason in the West has meant that the public discourse has privatized questions about the good life, about a beauty and goodness in ways that before, when you have a shared symbolic structure of any religious tradition or a philosophy or whatever, then there's like a mythopoetic container, a yearly rhythm and rituals and stuff that then frame life transitions, tragedies, joys, and all that kind of stuff. But and so the question of the good life happens in a community with shared framing stories, right? But when it gets privatized, in some sense, that allows for a beautiful diversity. And the individual now is responsible for something a human has never been responsible for almost any part of history. Most humans didn't hang out with every religious tradition on their street, and none. Most of them, like, and if they did, they were getting them to join or pretend they joined, right? Like, yeah. And so there's this sense that, like, we are in a different place, and we haven't even learned how to ask the right questions. And it's uncomfortable because we want to affirm the pluralism and the possibility of fulfilled life in a diverse perspectives, but we also don't want a vacuous public square where I think we're at a point where the public square's vacuousness is coming back to bite us, right?
Yeah, I think that the question that you asked, or what you described there about the moral individual, the person who is pursuing the good life, and that in the world that we've created, largely in the West, that has been pressed by pluralism. There are the sort of the demands of pluralism have made us ask new questions about the nature of the good life and how we live that. But those questions, as you well know, those are not new questions. I mean, we can go back to ancient philosophy, and there are people making arguments where they're saying that, the dairy farmer and the baker woman all are perfectly capable of the good life, and that people in very modest circumstances can be people of good character and live a kind of nobility. And so that idea that came out of sort of Greco-Roman culture, certainly, that extended into the American Revolution. That was a really important part of the ideas, I think some of the best ideas of America that Thomas Jefferson wrote about. And, that nobility wasn't dependent upon wealth. And of course, if it didn't depend upon wealth, it wouldn't depend upon slavery. And he wrote so philosophically about the possibility of just the regular person living the good life in a sense that was even better than any European noble ever could. And so that humble kind of approach to character was really part of the Enlightenment project, and we've inherited it. And so it was there, and it got messed up, obviously, because of slavery, and because I think of other forms of wealth construction and the construction of class that undermined, I think, the idealism of individual nobility back in the late 18th century, actually. And so I would argue that it isn't so much pluralism that has created the circumstance as rather inheriting a tradition of the moral person in community and the vision of everyone being able to do that, and there being a kind of community of ennobled souls, that we inherited that sort of tradition philosophically through time. But in the 21st century, I think that corporate culture is the most destructive thing. I think that,
Oh yeah.
I think that it's possible that we could have, and certainly other cultures have tried to have certain kinds of civic rituals that repristinate our commitment to that. And one of the things that I actually loved about Obama, even though I know people have a lot of issues with Obama and his ties to more corporate democratic kinds of stuff, is that at least linguistically, Obama had a real vision of this, and he in all of his speeches created a kind of a new history, a new historical and philosophical narrative of the good life that included Stonewall, that included the civil rights movement, that included Seneca Falls, that included Sojourner Truth, that included Harriet Tubman, and pointed towards this sort of large cast of American characters, white, black, Asian, gay, straight, you name it, who did live noble lives, who in effect were American saints. And that I think he opened our imaginations towards the possibility of a sort of ritual, liturgical, public construction of how we might engage that tradition in the 21st century.
Can I ask you a follow-up? Because in one sense, that you have the feature that Obama told our story back to us, right? Where it was more beautiful in light of, I don't know, a deeper account of the good life, right? Like as a community, but yet it was also, you had the feature you named before that are, I don't know, the corporatist hijacking of our lives. It creates this context that makes it really difficult to ever get around to whatever your particular conception of the good life is, even if you acknowledge and let the diversity in, because the modern subject is always having to gain. You always have to be getting more or you're losing, right? Like there's this internalization where so the good life becomes something that's always ahead of you. And so you have to get more, right? Like you have to, Rosa, we'll read this in the group in week 5 or 6, our secular age group. He talks about that modernity is always trying to make things more attainable, accessible, and available. And that drive you see just in like all you do for your kid, just to turn them into a person that has their thing where they feel fulfilled, and all the networks and all the things to get, to succeed. And you're always running because you know that I can't opt out of the system that drives me to burnout. And the whole time I'm doing it, I'm signing my kid up for it. It's just, there is no society where this logic of constant growth isn't there. And so then you look at this beautiful questions any religious tradition gives you, or the Stoics or whatever, and there's this vision of the good life. You're like, that is so good. So once I know I'm stable through my retirement, I'm able to own a home, I know my kids can go to college, like eventually I'll get to a place where I can wake up, read the paper, have a cup of coffee, and volunteer, and or maybe not, but at least on vacation I will have a culture outing. Like that. I think the part of the problem is that we haven't attended deeply to the way our culture is so shaped by the necessary drive for growth and the anxiety that we then internalize.
You know, I believe that, and I think you've just articulated it perfectly, especially the way it appears in the literature. Though I've been thinking about it slightly differently in recent months, and that is, I think it's less about gain, which becomes about greed, and I've written about greed too. You know, I can't remember. I wrote a recent Substack about Gordon Gekko and the Age of Greed. It could have even been in the piece that I wrote about Christianity after religion. But that drive of achievement, the greed, the billionaire, you know, sort of worldview, et cetera. See, what happens with that is we're still essentially placing the blame on individuals. Is we're saying that somehow individuals who are pursuing this kind of rabbit trail are bad people, because they are caught up in this sinful vision. And even us, you know, we feel it. And in effect, the need for that gain cuts into our ability to live the good life. But, you know, I don't think it's gain as much as it is security.
And it's like securing your place because you know people are always getting cut out.
Well, I think it's partly that, because see, again, that's putting it on the individual. I have to secure a place for me and my family because somebody else will get in line, take our chair from this table. So there's a sense where, you know, there's a limited universe and we have to have our space and a space to keep our children at that table, or else we know what will happen because we see what will happen. When we open our door, we drive through our cities, or we turn on television and we see it, we try to hide the poor, but the poor are our moral example not to become them. What I really think the security is not just that. I think it is actual security. I think it is the need for perpetual military presence to protect corporate structures. And so security is not just, oh, me and my need to sit at this table so that my children stay fed, but security is the actual protection of these structures by giving our wealth, our treasure, our time, our talent, to creating a hedge of sort of military protection around what we have so that it can't be destroyed. And all of that was brought to a head on 9/11. Is that 9/11 was about, and you never, I wished I would have heard more churches talk about this. You know, it was so easily circumvented into anti-Muslim stuff. But why did people attack us on 9/11, and why did they pick the World Trade Center? You know, it was about money, and it was about the fact that our military was in countries where they shouldn't have been, protecting streams of wealth in order to provide security for wealthy Western nations to become wealthier. It's literally actual physical security. We're trying to protect ourselves from the fear of our own destruction. And the corporations, of course, need that, because if human beings are destroyed, they don't have a market. They don't have people to buy their products. They actually need physical security in order to ensure markets. And so I think what's driving all of this, our incapacity to live the good life, is fear. Period. And that fear is, you know, I mean, you pointed it out. The fear in certain ways is illogical, but in other ways it's perfectly logical. Why do you want to why did Trump win by wanting to close the borders? Because people are afraid of huge numbers of people crossing the border into the United States and upsetting the flow of markets and market goods.
Mm-hmm.
And so so it's not just greed. I want to keep this for myself, but it's actual, I am afraid of anything that would threaten the very existence of these markets or this wealth. And we are going to huge lengths to protect ourselves from fear, to provide security, not greed. Security is the god of the West. And so that immediately causes horrible problems, because if you will do anything to stem the fear, you will violate almost any moral code book that there is. And it also means that individuals possess the power to resist it. Because if you in your own life refuse to live in fear, well, then you are outside. You're then functioning as an outsider to the culture of fear. The more hopeful, optimistic, loving that you can be, the more you are actually creating a life of resistance to security. Because, of course, optimism, hopefulness, joy, all of these things, they give you the capacity to laugh in the face of fear. They give you the capacity to open your doors to strangers. They give you the capacity to accept what comes as a result of making choices. And so you get really amazing characters like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose last works, while he's in prison, actually ring with both prophecy against this kind of culture and joy.
Yeah.
And so this is what I am more convinced than ever that our capacity to sing, our capacity to dance, our capacity to express joy, our capacity to see a hopeful future, our capacity to embrace the good life, that is our resistance. And it doesn't mean we do it perfectly. Nobody does it perfectly. There is always temptation. The garden, the evil of the garden always yawns in front of us. But perhaps the evil of the garden always yawns behind us and is always calling us back towards that fear. But we can be different people. And so that's what I think it is. I think it's fear, and I think it's wrapped up in security. I think that's the sin of contemporary culture.
Well, I didn't know we were signing up for a revival, Diana. Are we ready to? Are we going to walk the aisle now? Like,
oh my gosh. Well, I just want to talk about Jesus. And see, this is why I think Jesus is so important, is that Jesus is the primary example of living this way. You know, it's like, if you don't have Jesus, you know, you're a Christian person, you've cut yourself off from the greatest model in all of our history to live free of fear. Even when the whole oppressive system comes crashing down on you and creates the worst possible circumstance for your life, takes your life. Jesus, and then those post-resurrection accounts, of course, are about joy beyond fear, about joy beyond death. They can take everything. Security doesn't matter in a world that you live in the joy of God.
Well, you know, one of the reasons I love the Jesus book, and you know, thinking of it in the context of, you know, your last 4 books, that it's the answer to, you know, what do we do with the whole believing thing, right? Like, if before it was this big cutoff, like, and every denomination and tribe had their list of beliefs,
right?
You go back to this a multiplicity of testimonies. Like, in a sense, there's like this big tent with like every chapter is a different Diana in this big story of Diana, one member of the body of Christ, and she gives her testimony through time. And you would never say to it, because it's literally you each time, well, is this one true if this one's true? Because I'm not exactly sure. Right? Like, you don't say that about your own story. And yet there's a multiplicity, this diversity of testimonies there. And I think that, you know, one of the striking things about that is It reminds me of this passage where Whitehead, which said that the brilliance of Christianity is that it doesn't come with a metaphysic and a set of beliefs. It comes with a story where the most profound thing was the execution of a righteous one. And then every generation has to ask the big questions we've always asked, like, why is something rather than nothing? What is good? What is beautiful? Like, what is justice? All those things. But it begins by telling that particular story that necessarily resist certain kinds of answers. And that your Jesus book isn't a Christology. It's just all the Jesuses you've known. I think is a rather profound invitation.
Well, I think that it is a book that invites people to see these things really kind of entirely differently. I mean, I might want to, sort of lean into the idea that it could be an experiential or memoir Christology, as it were. But no, it's not Christology in any kind of formal sense. But what I love about it, and what I loved about writing it, is I realized that my first theological understandings came before I could even read. And the first chapter about Jesus as friend is basically the experience of pre-literate Diana in coming to know Jesus. And because I was born in the middle part of the 20th century in the United States, and when the population was still, largely churched, even if not, faithful, and people went to church, people talked about Christianity, people had a sort of a relative kind of Christian thing going on in public space. And so it was an unusual life in the early 1960s of a Christian person that didn't hear the name of Jesus. I mean, you just did. And so those were all my first experiences, were hearing that name and then trying through my childhood imagination to process the stories that were being attached to that person, and the wonder of a Jesus who could live easily in the manger scene and in my Barbie house and in the woods across the street from my house. And that there was sort of this really, to use the sociological language, enchanted universe that children inhabit. And Jesus was just there with me. And so to take that voice and to remember that, I mean, I loved remembering that. I was writing that chapter during the pandemic, if you think about it. When I'm cut off from all my friends, I'm writing about my friend Jesus. It was very healing and very powerful to go back in my memory to those early days, and then to not only write about it as if I was 4 and reimagining the universe, reconstructing the universe that I lived in then, but then to take the sort of wonder of that into my 60-year-old voice and reflect on that theologically and put it in conversation with the Bible and put it in conversation with church history and with current events. And so that's how each chapter works. I reflect on the chapter as if I were 4 or 10 or 14 or 20 or 29 or 40, and talk about each one of those different Jesuses along the way, and to both recapture the wisdom of my lived experience and to then put it in conversation with sort of larger experience out of the tradition. So that's the book. And I think that, when our conversation about the good life, I think that there's a real sub theme throughout the book that is about my reaching for, my struggle to live the good life in as Christian a fashion as I possibly can, and to pursue a life of love and a life of healing, which for me then is also a life of justice in this world, without being consumed of questions around heaven and hell.
Okay, so I'm our detour down Christianity after religion and how all four books been. I didn't get to quite a bit of questions, so I'm going to ask you three of them,
Okay, I'll try to
and
be
you don't
really
have
fast.
to. And but I'm not allowed to have an opinion about anything you say. Well, I will, but I won't say it.
I was gonna say what? Oh, that's new.
Yeah, I mean it's a yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna ask you these three questions. So I
Okay.
don't want to. I don't want to go long, but also like some of them are real fun, and I was like, if they ask a question and I actually want to know the answer, then I'm like, well, I definitely want to ask this question. All right. So one is when you're working on the Jesus book, was there a particular narrative in the gospel that you came back to, or a parable, or anything, where all of a sudden it has a new meaning and you cling to it? Like the whole Jesus book, was there a particular part of the Jesus story in scripture that came alive again?
I would say there were several, and this is just a quick detour of the things that meant the most to me. One, the talking about the friendship chapter, I just adore talking about that because I had not realized what a powerful theme that is throughout the Old and New Testaments, and I think it really is kind of an underplayed um, theological idea that actually has a lot of cultural attractiveness in the 21st century, and that sadly enough, I think most contemporary Christians kind of look down their noses at. And indeed, there was actually just this week um, a mostly nice review of Freeing Jesus on Amazon. It was gracious, it was thoughtful, but the guy who wrote it literally said, "Well, that chapter on friend, where the book starts, most of the men in my group didn't like it, but when I took it home and was reading it with my wife and kids really thought it was neat." And I just went, oh, Lord have mercy. Here is this guy actually living out what I say in the book, is that white male Christians actually look down their noses at the theological idea of friendship, whereas women and children have often practiced it very deeply, and it is meaningful to women and children. And so it was kind of sexist, and I'm sorry to that nice reviewer, but you need to go back and revisit that. So anyway, so that was a really meaningful part of the book. Another important part was realizing that in the Gospels, the thing that Jesus is referred to most often by the people who knew him is they called him friend or teacher. And that word teacher is the word rabbi, and that in the first century, rabbi was a new word. It was basically a word that was coming out of first century emergent Judaism to describe a wise leader who gathered a group of disciples around him or her and interpreted it was almost always hymns, but interpreted the tradition, the Torah, in new ways through storytelling. And so that Jesus was part of that movement of these first century rabbis wandering around ancient Palestine is pretty cool. And the fact that that's how Jesus' friends referred to him. And at Easter, for example, when I was reading the John account of the resurrection this year, Mary turns around in the garden. Mary Magdalene turns around the garden and sees Jesus, doesn't immediately recognize him. And then after a short little conversation, she looks at him and she says, Rabboni. And the word of recognition is the word teacher. And there were some early Christian fathers who took that to mean that Mary Magdalene still didn't get it, that women still didn't understand the power of resurrection. Is that if she really understood what had happened in the resurrection, she would have called him Savior, or some Christos, or whatever. And yet she didn't. She called him teacher. But I think that the early church fathers got that wrong. I think that the power of that story is not that Mary Magdalene doesn't understand, that she understands, is that the Jesus who is standing with her is the same Jesus who has been her teacher. And that teacher was holy. Rabboni was holy, that it was a gateway to the knowledge of God. And so anyway, I just think that was really something. So those are two of the things, and they appear fairly early in the book. which were very important to me. I think people can kind of get later in the book my passion and my ability to finally sort of recover a Jesus who is primarily the way of love. And I think that the gospel that I use the most throughout the book would probably be the Gospel of John, although Matthew would probably be a close second. And those are sort of my the two gospels I lean in most deeply at this point of my life. I love Matthew. I didn't for a long time, and now it's probably my favorite, but John is a close second.
Well, see, I'm not going to make a comment. I even had a fun one. Like, if anyone wants to go see what Kierkegaard does with the teacher in response to the resurrection, I was going to mention that. But
oh my gosh, now I got to go look.
I don't see, but I'm not saying it because I want to know there are two different questions
okay
came in on the same topic. And so one said, I'm trying to free Jesus. I got a lot of Jesus baggage. I don't want to give the Jesus baggage unnecessarily to my kids. Any advice? And the other was, I don't have a church in my small town that can be a community of Jesus followers that don't have a whole lot of things that are triggering, burdensome, and were traumatic for me. Advice on finding a community to follow Jesus. Do you set boundaries? And then there's a bunch of examples, but both of them I think are looking for wisdom from someone they trust on. Like, how do you share Jesus after Christianity in a community when you're parenting?
I kind of did it by the seat of my pants. My daughter is 23 now, and so I'm not entirely convinced that I did it perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. But I was committed to a couple of things, and I think that that's what parents have to hold up, is to really say, okay, what is it about this story that I absolutely believe to be truthful? What is the most beautiful part of the story, and how do I communicate that to my children? And for me, there was one thing that was the most beautiful and the most truthful thing about the Gospels, and I communicate it in Freeing Jesus, and that is quite simple: love God and love your neighbor. That Christianity is a way of love. It's a way of love that Jesus embodied, and through friendship to the world, and through his teachings, and through those crazy events that are so hard to interpret about the death and his death and resurrection. It's about love, 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 love. Period. Full stop. And if it becomes about anything else, you're probably sending your kids down the wrong path. And so that's what I held out. And for my daughter, that really was very effective. She wound up majoring in religious studies at the University of Virginia, of all the crazy things. She was the only person who was sort of like the most out progressive, pro-gay Christian in most of her religious studies classes, which were haunted by evangelicals of various sorts who were either trying to escape the rest of UVA by majoring in religious studies, or trying to make sense of evangelicalism by learning something about theology. And so my daughter, she would literally call me up in the middle of classes, or she would text me and say, someone's talking about gay stuff. What verses should I quote? So it was hilarious. We actually had our relationship deepened through her whole experience in university. And so she really got it. And she just kind of is continually astonished by the fact that there's anyone in the world who calls themselves a Christian and acts in unloving ways. And she got that when she was 6. She understood hypocrisy about that when she was 6 years old. And so I say, just keep going with that. You never go wrong teaching a kid that God is about love.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can go wrong if you teach them that God is about love, and because of that, God is going to punish sinners in hell and burn eternally.
Well,
That's the
Diane,
one way you
love
can do it.
sometimes looks like eternal conscious torment. You
Yeah.
don't know that, but that's because the love's also holy.
Right.
And nothing says holy like eternal conscious torment.
That's exactly right. Like people burning, frying in hell forever. And so, you know,
that's not even a good enough description of how bad it could be.
So treat love with common sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So last question.
So that's
last question.
Oh, real quick though, the person who can't find community.
Sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't
I was trying to cut myself off from derailing.
I'm sorry, but I really want to have that person.
Oh no.
I feel like that's such an important question. It's really hard, and you're going to have to figure out if there is a community that you can be in and set boundaries. Unless you're a really strong person, I doubt it. And so what I would do is just, find some friends who are kind of spiritual and who share values that you have in whatever town that you live in, who may not be associated with a church, and, sort of take your faith with you to the coffee shop or to wherever those people gather, and just be with other humans and enjoy the presence of God where 2 or 3 are gathered, even if it is outside of a church. And then avail yourself to whatever theological resources you can through the internet and through occasional communal gatherings, like going to something like the Wild Goose Festival. Or I have had friends for years who've gone up to Holden Village in Washington who are Lutherans and go there for 2 weeks or a month in the summer and sort of fill their souls. Or go to Iona in Scotland. If you have any capacity to invest in that sort of travel to communal gatherings, that can be one of the best investments of your finances that you can make in a year.
All right, last question.
Yes.
Favorite Jesus movie?
Oh, wow.
I'm fine. This is what stumps you, is like out of all the things.
Isn't that funny? I kind of love Jesus Christ Superstar, which is probably not a big surprise to people. And I think I mostly love it because it came out when I was 10 or 12. I just loved the music and the album. I would play over and over and over again when I was a young teenager, and the music just meant a lot to me. And Tripp has disappeared. Maybe he's going to go and play Jesus Christ Superstar, which would be awesomely cool. So I think that's my favorite Jesus movie. There he comes.
Sorry, I started coughing and
oh
no.
I was like,
I know. I have these bubble waters, these carbonated waters. And I ran out like just a minute ago. And then I was like, I'm starting to cough and I'm getting paranoid. And of course, it's the only answer that's under 6 minutes, Diana. The singing though does make Jesus Christ Superstar like allure. But what about Jesus of Montreal? I think that's like the most underrated one.
I've never seen that one actually.
Okay, so it hadn't come out yet on the podcast, but I interviewed Helen Bond, New Testament historical Jesus scholar, and we were talking about Jesus films, and she's like, "Yeah, I haven't watched that one." And
I'm glad I'm not alone then.
No, she's head of school here at the University of Edinburgh. So I was like, well, my DVD copy doesn't work on any UK DVD players, which I don't understand why certain DVDs don't work in different countries. That seems weird because they
have codes in them.
Yeah. I'm like, all right, I'd share it with you, but you can steal it. You want to know, Marcus Borgen, John Dominic Crossan had the same favorite Jesus film. Do you want to guess what it was?
I have no idea. I never heard them answer this question. I'm really fascinated.
The Life of Brian.
Oh my gosh. Well, what a great answer.
They
I
both
love
said
that.
it, and I asked them it separately, and I was like, come on, like out of all of it, and Marcus goes, well, I just find it's able to bring up the tensions and the complications with the imperial issues so well, and then how the apocalyptic Jewish context would have really, like, he's going through this whole thing, and then the origin of any religious group, like when it goes to the holy sandal, and of course he would say it's not the holy sandal. Like, you're always having to deal with this in such a rich time with going on. And John Dominic Cross, and I asked him, and he and I was like, really? I was like, that's what Marcus said. He goes, oh, I know he like it, but he answers this question way too seriously. I just laughed the whole movie from the time he says, blessed are the cheesemakers. and
oh my gosh.
But he says it, with his like Irish accent.
Yes, perfect.
And he's and Irish or Scottish people imitating the like exaggerated posh UK accent is very funny. It's like a redneck impersonating like a Yankee. And blessed all the cheesemakers. and but he like redid that whole scene, where all the Sermon on the Mount mistakes, and I'm like, that's high quality. I feel like y'all should do a Mystery Science Theater 3000 where it's just the Jesus Seminar duo having commentary while they watch Jesus movies.
I kind of love it. That's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that question before. And I think it's interesting because Dom and Marcus actually did have, they have both great senses of humor. And that's what I was talking about, how joy and laughing and all this sort of stuff. I mean, to me, that's a necessary component of Christian formation, is the capacity to just let it go, as the joy of heaven just breaks into everything. And in fact, that's kind of why I love Jesus Christ Superstar. Mm-hmm. And I can remember when I was a teenager listening to that record, I got into so much trouble when my parents would come in. They would say, that's not very reverent. I'd be dancing around in my room. What's the news? Tell me what's happening. What's the news? Tell me what's happening. And so, I mean, I thought it was like a party, it's mm-hmm. like the gospel was a party to me in that. And even when it got serious and sad and, it's, oh my God, Jesus is going to die. It was still lyrical, mm-hmm. It took me places. And, I always love, musicals anyway, and Broadway. So that's just part of who I am.
Well, what's your favorite Godspell song then? Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I don't know.
What's the, I'm trying to remember which one the
people in my Bible church like that one better because
there's less heresy. Less heresy in it.
That's right. That's what they said. Oh my gosh, you can't like Jesus Christ Superstar. There's no resurrection. They would always freak out about that. There's no resurrection. It's like, okay, there wasn't in the book of Mark either. But I didn't say that when I was 15 to them.
That's so. Yeah, they I don't know if they're ready to hear that.
I was a troublemaker at the time. So.
Yeah, you know what's fascinating. All right, I'm just adding one question because someone asked it, and then I started going like, I don't know what Diana thinks about this, and I really want to know. Someone said who was a part of the whole emerging church movement and everything, and they asked like, how does Diana see the history of the emerging church movement, its changes, and how does that whole previous kind of 10-year emerging church movement compared to the new eruption of people deconstructing or whatever in the current process? Like, what happened to the emerging church movement and how does it differ from the current one?
I think a lot of people expected emergent church stuff to sort of go from movement to institution, go from movement to successfully, changing certain things about the way congregations and perhaps even denominations work. But I don't think that it was a movement that worked that way. I mean, I think it was a movement that created friendships, and a lot of those friendships now have lasted for decades, and that people have done their work not necessarily in the service to renewing institutions, but solely, we've done this work in conversation with one another and in service to where we thought the Spirit was moving in the world. And so there are people who moved more into sort of justice questions with some of the impulses from those conversations 20 years ago. Some people who've moved more into academia, some people who have become more distinctly associated with particular theological traditions. An awful lot of people from emergence moved into process theology. And then, I think that one of the things that I've done is I've tried to just create conversations in the world to make space for people to think about God differently. So instead of it being about liturgy or an institution, it's for me become almost a kind of an evangelistic task on a very personal basis, to have conversations with my readers that open their eyes to a different future of faith. And so I think that we met at a moment in history, we inspired one another, we influenced one another, and we continue to walk. Some of us together, some of us a little bit further apart than we once were. But I think that we all still hold that it's a common kind of journey, and that we wouldn't be where we are without where we have been. So just because something doesn't become like the Methodist Church, from
Wait,
being...
is anyone trying to become the Methodist Church?
Well, I was thinking about what was the most successful spiritual movement of all times, and it certainly had to be the Wesleys. It's just because the Wesleys did that. Gosh, and should we bless them or curse them? The Methodists are probably asking that question for themselves right now.
Love divine, all love.
Yeah, we should bless them for the music. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you got to admit,
those are hymns.
Think of how many hymnals would just have the penal all over the place if it wasn't for Wesley hymns.
Oh my gosh,
Wesley's
yes.
like, don't you think we should broaden out the work of God and Christ to include imparting infinite love into the beating heart of the church? And then like Isaac Watts, like, no.
The Calvinist gets their revenge,
Yeah.
So, but anyway, yeah. So, just because emergent doesn't become sort of institutionalized and have a lasting institutional label doesn't mean it failed. It meant that it was a particular kind of movement for a particular moment.
Yeah. No, and I do think people, all right. This is on a live stream, so I'm changing my mind about what I was going to say.
Uh-oh.
I know. Well, you have to do that when you get older. You have to self-edit.
You do?
Yeah. I'm not saying I'm good at it, Diana. But so the last part of that question was like from that whole journey in the past, and then like processing it with a more mature voice in the last 4 books. Is there particular wisdom for those just now discovering there's like another live option? I get people find the podcast, they send me emails and they're doing stuff. They're like, is there even a way to be Christian without insert things that I haven't even been to a church that does that in forever? And I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of options. There's actually the Catholic Church doesn't do it that way. Right. Mainline Protestants not worried about these things. Like, but for those that are just now coming out of and starting that kind of shock moment,
my main advice goes back to that sort of really powerfully deep part of our conversation about corporate stuff and security, is that don't be afraid. And I think there are lots of strands of Christianity that hold people as members or hold people's kinds of theological imaginations hostile, and they do it through fear, because they're, while corporations do it, or demanding security in order to protect their markets, religious institutions demand security in effect, by trying to hold their members, and the security they offer is that you'll have eternal life. And so they create this fear that when you die, you will cease to exist. Nothing will ever matter again. You're going to just disappear. In both cases, the corporation or the religious corporation, it's about, creating a marketplace, for your ideas. And it's a marketplace based on fear, whether it's winding up in hell or winding up impoverished, and so there journeys can start out of fear. And I would never want to say that you can't start a journey out of fear. And there will also be fearful times along any journey, but keep going. Just keep going, and know that your story is unique, but there have been people who have walked paths that are very close to yours. And so you're not alone. And the more you can do to try to reach beyond the path that you're on and try to, sometimes you're grabbing for hands in the dark. You will find other people, and you will find podcasts and books and wisdom, and you'll find friends in church history, and you'll find friends who are alive now that will surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
So just try, don't be afraid. Keep going.
Definitely. That excellent advice. So I've had a blast getting to talk to you. Even though half the questions I had planned to talk about, we didn't get to. It was like we lapsed into a conversation we would have had without being on the internet. But that just means there's even a better reason to go get the book, Freeing Jesus. And
there is a really powerful chapter in here about when I chose a fearful and wrong way to follow Jesus, chapter 5. And I talk about how that almost ended my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a incredibly honest. I terrified myself when I wrote that chapter. And so it's a very honest sort of dissection of deconstruction and what can go wrong. And I put it there purposefully to encourage people to know that you can sometimes go the wrong way. And even when you do, there's still plenty of capacity to turn around and go back toward the way of love. And so I definitely want people to know that Freeing Jesus is not a book about a perfect sort of path towards a Jesus that is free of every encumbrance of conservative Christianity. It's a lurching, honest, searching story about who Jesus is and finding Jesus in profoundly difficult circumstances sometimes, while also finding Jesus in your Barbie house. And so I tried the book to be as real as it possibly could be. It came from my experience. And so in that way, I just want to affirm people who are listening, is that your experience really matters. Your story really matters. It matters to the Jesus story. It matters to the people around you. And I just want you to live it as fully and beautifully with as much grace and goodness as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out. It's been a blast. I'm really glad we met each other a long time ago.
Yeah, me too.
And you tolerated me when I was annoying. I mean, I might still be, but I don't get the vibe that you're deciding if I'm annoying anymore,
I think at first I wasn't quite sure.
Well, you weren't the only one.
But I just adore you, Trip. I think you're wonderful. And, I thought if we were free this year, I would have definitely come to Scotland while you were there to visit and see Edinburgh with you.
Well, we would have had fun. So
We would
I'll
have.
just dream about whatever it is we would have done. Hopefully, we wouldn't have got arrested, but got close. Was it, maybe Richard would have talked us out of getting in trouble.
Well, I love Edinburgh. I'm trying to think of where we would get arrested.
I have a list. We got another month. They just added a month before things really opened up again because of the new variant. So
Yeah.
we'll see. I just
Well, I hope you get out of your basement once in a while there.
it's true. I keep wondering what exactly I could do with all this stuff. It's we found a sander, and Alicia is much more crafty than me. You know those pallets they use like at moving stuff around at a warehouse?
Uh-huh.
She built a bench out of pallets, then like sanded it, painted it like 6 different pastel colors and polished it, and then like weatherized it in a way it looks vintage, even though it was just made.
Wow.
Because we found all the like down here, like sanders and a nail gun and all sorts of stuff. I was like, oh, who knows what else is down here? I don't know. I could build all sorts of stuff.
Did you
Nothing
put it in the
illegal,
garden?
Facebook. Yeah, it's in the front yard where she can, like, in the day when Haven's running around when everyone else is gone, and he's playing in sand and stuff, you can use it. So,
Lovely.
yeah, I was like, I did construction one summer and then got straight A's after that. I was like, I can't do this. I'm not gifted.
Well, you're busy building a theological vision of the world.
That's
there
right.
You go.
That's right. You're welcome, universe. But thank you. Tell Richard hi. And did y'all have fun for the birthday?
Yes. I hope you did too.
Oh, yeah. It's always good to find out people have close birthday. I have a whole bunch of friends that are like all born the same week I was. So
it was a big week for birthdays. So I was, and I told everybody on Twitter it was your birthday. So I hope a lot of people said happy birthday to you. So.
Yeah, I support all positive attention. You don't have to worry. Like if you're saying to yourself,
I was worried.
Say something nice. You could say it. I know plenty of people would be like, don't give me any extra attention. Me, on the other hand, I mean, I might downplay it publicly, but just know I always appreciate it. And
good.
People tweet nice things. I'm just like, I think I'm going to retweet that just so other people know people said nice things about me.
I think that's important. And I was a little worried about you being lonely, so I wanted people to say nice things to you.
Well, it was successful. Successful. All righty. Well, I'm going to bed. It's
late. I have to finish a piece for CNN on Southern Baptists.
Oh, whoa.
I know.
Good luck.
Thank you.
I just, I don't, the second conservative takeover only went halfway. That's what I gathered from reading Twitter.
Oh yeah. They're not
like the most conservative person. Oh, they're not done yet.
I don't. No. This convention is done, but they're not done yet. They'll be back.
And if Paige Patterson can find some buses, don't. Anyway, next time we're not being on the internet, remind me to tell you about the time I waited tables for Paige Patterson when I was working at Applebee's in undergrad. It's a fascinating story, and it may cohere with your internal prejudice. That's why I wasn't going to share it online.
I only have one question. Does he tip well?
No.
I didn't think so.
No. I'm sure it's because he graded one paper at the table and probably charged it to the seminary, just like all the taxidermy for all the dead animals in his house and the new china. But who knows? I don't know all the details. I don't know the details. But as someone that grew up in Wake Forest, I do know that guy got in charge, and the city hates the seminary for all the things he did. That's when they switched from like stick on parking passes to hangers because the cops were not thrilled with it. And they like promised not to sell property and then did, and then developed it and stuff, and obviously did it for the glory of God, just like everything else he's done that most people call unethical. But
But the greatest theological bookstore and used theological bookstore in all of America was in Wake Forest, North Carolina.
Stevens Bookshop. I know. Well, I sat next to Mr. Stevens at church at Millbrook Baptist Church in Raleigh before he moved to Scotland, and walking bibliography. Like,
oh yeah,
I'd tell him what I'm working on. He'd come to church and he was like, "Well, I have a few suggestions for you."
Okay, my friend, you have a good night's sleep. Great to be with everybody at Homebrewed.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.